There are dragons in almost every ancient culture. There were dragons in Europe, there were dragons in the Middle East, there were dragons in China, but there were also dragons in North and South America. Now, people had to actually see those dragons in order to be able to describe them, and they've been described in the literature. The interesting thing is that scientists have posited that people from Asia came across a land bridge into North America. And the land bridge was melted, according to these scientists, 20 to 25,000 years ago. If that's the case, and the earliest dinosaur stories that have been found were 7,000 BC, if you believe the scientists, and what that means is that the people that lived in North and South America had to actually see the dinosaur to describe it, since there were no dinosaur descriptions that they could have read, since that land bridge had melted. Now, if that land bridge was gone, they had no way of communicating between the cultures in the old world, China, that talks about dinosaurs, and North and South America, that also has dinosaur stories. The better explanation is that the Leviathan talked about in the Old Testament in Job was a dragon, and that he actually existed. Now, you say, well, how can a dinosaur breathe fire? Well, there are a number of chemicals that, when they combine, cause combustion and cause fire. Oxidizing agents, for instance, nitric acid, and reducing agents, such as hydrazine, may cause fires or explosions when they mix. Okay, I mean, he could have had pouches on the side of his head. Sodium metal and other materials in water will flame or explode. Iron sulfide and oxygen, air may ignite spontaneously when brought together. Potassium added to water will explode because mixing an alkali with water will cause an explosion. Mixing potassium chlorate with table sugar and sulfuric acid can cause a fire. But you say, so what? I mean, there's never been an animal that can cause an explosion by combining chemicals. Well, we know that's not true. We know there is a beetle, and it's called the bombardier beetle. And that beetle can cause chemicals to explode out of its rear end that smell disgusting to anybody that wants to eat it. And so if this little bombardier beetle can do that, dragons can do it. So,
makes sense.
All right. We also talked about the chemical compounds. Let's talk about the bombardier beetle a little more. The bombardier beetle mixes hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide to cause this little explosion, doing the same kind of mixing that we posit could be possible for a dragon to cause flames. And if this beetle can have separate sacs in its body containing separate chemicals, why couldn't a dragon? If God created the bombardier beetle, he could also have created a dragon. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is people. People who disappeared from history or who were thought not to exist. So we're going to talk about Joseph, which was stated in Genesis and Exodus, whose reality was not confirmed by modern archaeology until the 20th century. We're going to talk about Samson, who is discussed in Judges 13 through 16. It wasn't confirmed until about 2012 that he actually existed. We're going to talk about Pontius Pilate. He's talked about in the Gospels. It was confirmed in the Gospels in the 1st century AD, but it was reconfirmed in 1961. So let's talk about some of these things. The story of the exodus of the Jews from Egypt begins with Joseph, when he was sold into slavery by his brothers. But he becomes the most powerful man next to the Pharaoh in Egypt. Okay. So how do we prove he existed? There is substantial proof outside the Bible that he existed. There was a large city of Semites that was located on the eastern Nile in the land of Goshen. And it was discovered in about the mid-1960s. It has houses which often had burial sites under the dwelling. You say, so what? But that is a tradition of Ur of the Chaldees, that they would put their burial sites under their house. And if you remember, Joseph's forefathers came from Ur, and so they would have had that same custom. Now, there was also found in that area some tombs. There were 12 tombs found. One was larger than the other. It was in the shape of a pyramid. Now, when they uncovered the other tombs, they found bones in them. When they uncovered the tomb that was shaped like a pyramid, the bones were gone. And if you remember in the Old Testament, the Israelites were directed to take Joseph's bones back to be buried with his ancestors. And the pyramid structure is also important to the story. Pyramids were only used to bury people of high importance, okay? Which Joseph would have been second in charge behind Pharaoh. And so they assumed that with the bones gone, with the structure being in the shape of a pyramid, that Joseph, in fact, had been buried there along with his brothers. The archaeologists think that they found proof that Joseph existed and that Joseph's bones were taken back to Israel. Then there's Samson, the story of Samson and Delilah. And the story is that his hair was cut, he was allowed to go back, and that he pulled the pillars of the temple down and killed the Philistines. The accuracy of the Samson story and even his existence was challenged over the years. Some scholars have described it as a mere mythology. They compare Samson to Hercules. They've taken the position that he wasn't an actual person. But relatively new support for the story that Samson killed a lion exists, and there's also support, relatively new support, for the fact that Samson pushed down the temple and could have killed the Philistines. For instance, as to him killing a lion, there was a seal uncovered by Israel archaeologists in 2012. It was found by Tel Aviv University archaeologists, and it shows a man and a lion in combat. It was found at a level of excavation that dates to the 11th century BC. That is considered the period of the biblical judges, including Samson. And the seal is dated very close to the time recorded in Judges, written about 1043 BC. More relevant, perhaps, was that it was found in a home in Beth Shemesh. That's a city in which Samson is said to have been born and the place where he was buried. And it's a city that's on the road to where his wife had lived. So that's significant. But there's other proofs. There's proof of the Philistines fighting a war with the Israelites, about the 5 cities of the Philistines gathering together to fight this battle. Then there's always been some question about how Samson pushed the temple down. This is the way the temple is typically depicted. massive stone columns, lots of stone and that kind of thing. But archaeologists have recently uncovered what they believe is a Philistine temple, and it doesn't look anything like this. This is what it looks like. And in this Philistine temple, there are 2 pillars, you can see them in there, that are about 6.5 feet apart, that if a strong man had been tied to it, he could have easily pushed the pillars out and caused the whole thing to topple in on the Philistines. And they would have services inside, but sometimes they would go on the upper deck and they would, to stay cool, have services outside. And if he pushed these pillars out and the whole thing came crashing down, it would have killed most, if not all, of the people that had been at the temple that day. And there are Old Testament places that have only recently been reconfirmed. Babylon was stated throughout the Bible. Ezekiel, Daniel, Zechariah, Jeremiah, but they were confirmed in the 19th century. And then the Ur of Chaldees was lost to history. It was confirmed in the 20th century. Sodom and Gomorrah was confirmed in 1989. Tower of Babel was confirmed in the 19th century. So let's talk about Babylon. Babylon is referenced over 280 times in the Bible.
Yeah.
Daniel talks about it. Zechariah talks about it. They just have different definitions for it. But Babylon's existence, its beauty, has never, has been questioned over time. And it was unknown to modern historians until it was confirmed by a German professor and architect who excavated it in the 1800s, 2,400 years after Daniel was written. Historians now believe that Babylon was the first ancient city to exceed 200,000 people. Then there's the Ur of Chaldees. It was talked about in Genesis. Abraham appears in the Mesopotamian records, which is some indication that he was in fact a true person. But critics in the 1800s denied the existence of Abraham's hometown of Ur. And that was until Sir Leonard Woolley's excavations from 1922 to 1934 uncovered an immense ziggurat or temple tower at or near the mouth of the Euphrates in Mesopotamia, which is where Ur was. And so they, inferred from that it was in fact Ur. Then there's Sodom and Gomorrah. That was really challenged by a lot of historians as being just mythology. But it was confirmed in 1989. Remember, Genesis 19 describes the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It was a biblical archaeologist named Ron Wyatt who discovered the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah southeast of the Dead Sea in 1989. It was estimated to have been occupied between 3500 and 1540 BC. That would have been about the time that the Genesis story talks about its destruction, before Abraham before Abraham set up his family in the Promised Land, before they, had their generations of children, before the Israelites went to Egypt, and before they lived there for hundreds of years. So when you take that time back, this time is consistent with when Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed. And there's the Tower of Babel. That was confirmed in the 19th century, even though biblical scholars have long debated whether the Tower of Babel really existed. A remarkable stone tablet was found that describes, and is dated about 600 BC, that describes the ziggurat of Babylon. And it's taken by most archaeologists to prove that was in fact the Tower of Babel. All of these things have just recently happened. So all of these things that people thought were myths are not myths. They're true. So let's talk about some New Testament places. Ephesus, we talked about in Acts and in Ephesians. That was confirmed as actually existing in 1869. And it was described, is now described by the Encyclopedia Britannica as the most important Greek city in Ionia, Asia Minor. And it was famed for its temple of Artemis.
Yes.
You remember
Right.
how much trouble it was gotten into when they tried to stop the sale of the idols? Well, it was famed for that, and it was discovered that it was destroyed by the Goths in 263 AD, and partially destroyed again by an earthquake in 614. And then it was deserted. And the true site of the Artemisium, which is the place where you worship Artemis, remains unsuspected until 1869 when it was discovered. Then there's Nazareth. Historians actually thought for a long time that Nazareth did not exist. Skeptics claimed that Nazareth was did not exist during the time of Jesus. The Israelis' Integrity Authority announced it had found a Nazareth house in 2009 with artifacts from the 1st century.
Wow.
When Nazareth existed and when Jesus was there. And archaeologists found a 1st century synagogue inscription in Caesarea proving that Nazareth existed. Then there's a pool of... Historians didn't believe that pool existed because it was of unusual architecture. It describes a pool which had 5 colonnades, and that was unusual for pools back then to have those kind of colonnades. And so the historians for almost 2 millennia talked about that it didn't exist. And that was eventually found as well, with 5 colonnades. There's a pool of Siloam, which was discussed by John, and it was discovered in 2004. You remember that's the pool where Jesus spit into the mud and he had the blind man wash off the water in the pool. And it was discovered in 2004, and it contains coins showing the pool was in use during the life of Jesus. Thousands of years again after it was stated in the New Testament. Then there's some events that we need to talk about. All right, let's talk about some Old Testament events. We'll talk about the flood. We'll talk about the ark. We'll talk about Jewish life in Egypt before the Exodus and Moses' miracles. We'll talk about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. And we'll talk about the parting of the Red Sea. All right, let's start out with talking about the ark. The ark was a feat of nautical engineering by a man who had no obvious nautical experience, Noah. He lived in the desert. As far as we know, he had never been in a ship, never designed a ship. But the ark handles as well as any thing ever built to sail the seas. So let's talk about the ark measurements. These are the ark measurements. It was to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. This is what a cubit looks like. The length of a cubit varied depending on the different ancient people that used the measurement. The Hebrew measurement was 17.5 inches, and it went all the way up to the Egyptian long measurement of 20.6 inches. Now, using those measurements, the ark would have been 515 feet long at most, 5 feet wide, and 60 feet high. Well, you kind of say, so what? But there have been scientific studies of the ark. One scientific study of the ark was done in 1993 by a South Korean group of scientists, agnostic at best, atheists, some of them. And they determined that the ark was as stable as any current water-going vessel. And that was followed up by a study by physics grad students at the University of Leicester in England, who concluded that it was also seaworthy. You don't think of the Bible necessarily as a scientifically accurate source of information. So this student said, so I guess we were quite surprised when we discovered it would work. Here's the thing. Back when the ark was built, the stability of a boat was not an important consideration. It was not an important consideration until the 19th century. When boats were built before, the biggest consideration was not stability or livability or that kind of thing. It was how they looked. How pretty were they? You know, how did my boat compare to another boat? Was it bigger? Was it sleeker? That kind of thing. But there wasn't a lot of thought given to why these dimensions were used. And the ark was built in such a way that it could withstand 100-foot waves. That's a pretty big tsunami if they had to face it, because the average tsunami is about 10 feet. 100 feet? It was built for stability. It was built based on the knowledge of somebody who knew how to build that boat, and that wasn't Noah. So again, the easiest conclusion you can reach is that it was built, with God's design in mind. All right, let's talk about life in Egypt before the Exodus. There is considerable disagreement about when the Exodus took place and about whether or not the things that were talked about in Exodus, such as using the bricks that didn't have enough hay in them and that sort of thing, whether that actually occurred. But they have now uncovered a building where the first course is properly made bricks with straw and what they would normally use, and the second course of bricks was not straw, but it was just rubble left over. That confirms the Exodus story. One of the largest statements made by God in Exodus is the plagues that Egypt had to go through. Now, there are about 90 Egyptian texts which contain parallels to Exodus. For example, there's an Egyptian scribe named Ipuwer who was an eyewitness to the Exodus plagues, and he recorded plague events in his papyrus that was acquired by the Museum of Leiden in 1828. This is a contemporary of the Exodus from Egypt that talked about the very plagues that the Bible talks about. Let's also talk about the parting of the Red Sea. That's a picture of it. Like it had to be a miracle to happen. Of course it had. But scientists have come up with all kinds of reasons that the sea may have parted the way it did. Reasons that just today don't make a lot of sense. At the bottom of the Red Sea, there have been divers that have found artifacts that are parts of chariots that went over, and they found wheels, and they found all sorts of things. The Red Sea story is also confirmed by the fact that there were monuments put on the Egyptian side of the Red Sea and on the Israeli side of the other side of the Red Sea, put up there by Solomon, and they mark where the Israelites passed through the water. Now, some people don't believe that the Israelites crossed into Egypt through the Red Sea. They believe that they probably took a more northern route across. They think that they because they were in the northern part of Africa, it made more sense if they took a northern route across, and that would better explain the parting of the Red Sea, because those waterways at the northern part of Africa are much narrower and much more capable of being split. But the historical evidence is that no, they had to go down to the Red Sea, and there was a reason for it. If you look at the Sinai Peninsula, the Philistines controlled the north 30% of that peninsula. So they wouldn't have crossed through the Philistine territory because they would have ended up in a war with the Philistines. This would have been a war between the Philistines, who were armed aggressors, very well trained and very warlike, with the Israelites, who had children with them, who had women with them, and who had men that were not militarily trained. So it wouldn't make any sense in terms of safety for them to cross over the north part of the Sinai Peninsula. So that is also some additional support for the fact that they crossed the Red Sea further south. I think that covers our discussion today about people, places, events, dragons, and dinosaurs.